Join me for a conversation with Matt Wilson from Privateer Press.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. I have been doing this podcast for a while, and I just consider it an absolute honor to be able to interview the guests that I have been able to talk to and then to share their knowledge with you. So I just wanted to take a second and thank you so much for listening. And if you like this podcast, please, would you just consider leaving an honest review wherever you are listening to the show? Reviews help more and more people discover the show. Again, I just want to thank you for listening. If you decide to leave a review, that would mean the world to me. And now we are going to head straight into another amazing interview. My guest today is the Chief Creative Officer of Privateer Press, Matt Wilson. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. I'm happy to be here.
I do like to start off the show just by asking, how were you introduced to war games or tabletop role-playing games?
Oh, boy. I'm going to show my age here real fast.
We all do.
I got introduced to role-playing games back when I was about 8 or 9 years old, which was right around 1979, 1980. Okay. Back then, they used to sell Dungeons and Dragons in the Sears catalog. Back then, catalogs were a big thing back then. And every year, the big Christmas catalog would come out and had a big toy section. And they used to put on these huge sort of showcase displays. And I can remember this 2-page spread in the catalog that year. And it had all these fantastic miniatures that were painted up, skeletons and monsters. And they had it all in this sort of like dungeon that they had built. And then they had the game books and everything. And I was absolutely fascinated. I was into board games and card games, just, the regular stuff you'd find in the home closet. As a kid, but when I saw the Dungeons and Dragons, it just sparked my imagination, and so I begged and begged for it, but I didn't actually manage to get my hands on it for a couple years after that. Okay. And so I had met a couple of friends that introduced me to it, showed me how to play, and even then I spent so much time, blacking in graph paper to make dungeons and creating adventures, and I was always the dungeon master in my group, so I just kind of fell into it naturally, and after a couple of years, I was making my own games. So I just sort of made that leap from playing and digesting the rules to wanting to modify and make up new stuff and new worlds, and one thing led to another. That's how I ended up here.
Okay, that's great. It does seem to be kind of a natural impulse. If somebody, usually the game master, the dungeon master, they want to start modifying or making their own settings or systems.
Yes, it's. I think so. I think when you've got the bug or the gene that inspires game design or that kind of creativity, it's really easy to fall into, and it's very. Everything's sort of spelled out for you. It's written words and it's simple math for the most part. And so it's easy to start putting those things together and modifying. When I was in high school, if I could give you a little anecdote here. I grew up in a really small town in Northern California. There was no game store. The closest game store was an hour away. Mm-hmm. The advanced Dungeons and Dragons books had come out. And so not having like access to this stuff, it was always really hard to get. I had a friend who had who did have the books though. And so he lent them to me for a period of time. And I didn't have access to a copy machine or anything like that. And so I spent many weekends and evenings hand transcribing all of the important details in those books into a binder so that I had that information to be able to play the game, because I didn't have a way to actually own the books. So in doing that, that was also a very sort of immersive exercise for learning the sort of deep nuance of game design.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I guess transcribing them by hand, you really got to know the rules then of the game.
Yeah, it seems ridiculous at an age where we can have a conversation over a computer, or you can take a picture of anything with the device in your pocket. But yeah, back then, that's how old I am. Old enough that I couldn't just use a copier.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm only just a little bit younger than you, but I certainly remember trying to convince my mom to take me to the library or the post office so I could make a photocopy of a character sheet or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, and now obviously you can just print them out online.
Yeah,
from offline. But that is something else that that you were transcribing them out, and I'm sure that that definitely had an effect, because then you went on to make gaming your career, right?
Yeah, it wasn't a plan. I sort of fell into it. I've always been an illustrator, and so out of high school, that's what I was trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
I went to school for a year to try and learn art, and it didn't work out so well. And at the time, I wanted to get into comic books, and so back in the early '90s, I started a small comic book company, and we only published a few books, but I got to learn quite a bit on my own about publishing. And then when I decided to close that up, I was looking around for something to do that was art related. And so I had some friends that knew people at AEG, the publishers of, at the time, they published a magazine called Shadis. And after I went to work for them, we went on to make the Legend of the Five Rings card game. So once I met them, and I was actually pitching a serialized comic for their magazine. And when I went out to meet them, I said, I also noticed that they were a very small company at the time, just about four or five people there. Mm-hmm. And I said, I noticed you don't have an art director on staff. If you think that you might need one, I'd be happy to come on board to do that. And so they called me back the next day and said, we're not interested in the comic, but we do need an art director because we want to make this card game. Mm-hmm. And I said, great. And so I started working with them. And other than, being an illustrator and doing some comics, I had no idea how to art direct it. So I made that up as I went along and figured it out. And then a few months later, we had a Legend of the Five Rings card game, which I art directed and did a lot of conceptual work for, and also got to help develop the game. And then eventually I ended up at Wizards of the Coast art directing Magic, and bounced around all over the place before Privateer.
Okay. I guess, I don't know if this is too much of a rabbit trail, but what does an art director do?
What does an art director do? An art director is tasked with creating the visual vision for a product. And so, and particularly when the product may need multiple artists working on it, or graphic designers, the art director is the person who sort of pulls that vision together to try and create, something that looks cohesive and works as a product, as a commercial product. The art director will give direction on the actual illustrations, working directly with artists to make sure that their composition works, that the designs work for the needs of the product. So basically, the art director knows the product that we want to make, and then it's their job to bring all the visual efforts together to make everything look great.
Thanks for humoring me there.
Sure.
But, I think sometimes just for people who are not in the industry, I think just some of the job titles and stuff can be a little confusing.
Yeah,
or maybe a lot confusing.
I should say I'll qualify that with at least that's what I think the art director does. That's what I did. So,
okay, fair enough. Okay, so you're working for some of these companies, including Wizards of the Coast. Then why did you start Privateer Press?
So I actually did 2 tours at Wizards of the Coast. I started there after AEG. I was the art director for Magic the Gathering for a year. And then I left for a couple years to work remotely for FOSSA, which you may remember the publishers of, at the time, they did Shadowrun and Battletech and Earth Dawn. And they brought me on as a concept artist to do conceptual illustrations for a new miniatures game they were creating called Vor the Maelstrom. And so that was the first miniatures game that I worked on, and I did that and did illustrations in the other game books for a couple of years. And then I went back to Wizards of the Coast and was there very briefly in the position of art director for their new miniatures division. And then after a few months, switched roles down into the illustration department. And for 3 years, I was the lead concept illustrator for Magic the Gathering. So I would design monsters and characters and all kinds of stuff. And then we'd have a visual Bible for each block of content that we needed to give artwork to. And then those concepts would go out to the 30 or 50 or 80 illustrators that would work on each Magic the Gathering release. And then I also did the illustrations for that, and I got to work on other products like Dungeons and Dragons at the time as well. So, and around that time, that was when third edition was coming out, and they had announced the open gaming license for the D20 books. And so I knew a couple of people at Wizards of the Coast that were already sort of doing side publishing, and so I got the idea that maybe that would be a fun thing to do. And I talked to a couple of friends into doing a project, and we put together our first D20 book, which was the first book in what we called the Witchfire trilogy. And it was just an adventurer module. I think that we still call them modules back then. And it was to support the D20 system. And so we established the Privateer Press label. And it was something that we did for fun. The other friends one was an artist, one was a writer. And so we just thought like, hey, we love playing the games. We love doing this stuff. We already work on this stuff all the time, but it's always for somebody else. What if we did it for ourselves? And what kind of product could we make? Would people like something that had, a really high quality level of illustration? And we just did it as sort of a passion project. This is while I was still working at Wizards of the Coast, and it went well. I mean, it was the book was well received, and a few months later we put out the second one, and then the third one over the course of about, I'd say, a year. And they did well enough that we could afford to keep doing them, but we weren't making an income off of it. It was basically just each book made enough money to like recoup our costs, and then move on to the next one, and maybe do it a little bigger, add some stuff to it. And so during that time, I want to say it was in 2002. Right before that, Wizards of the Coast, or at some point before that, Wizards of the Coast had been acquired by Hasbro. Mm-hmm. And I think it was about a year later when Hasbro started to shift some changes as things happen when companies get acquired. And so they decided to downsize the illustration department. And so all the illustrators were let go. But Wizards of the Coast was a very generous company, and they gave us 6 months notice. So we knew it was coming, and there was a very nice severance package. So I used that time to actually kick Privateer Press into high gear, and we started working on our first miniatures game, which would become War Machine. And so I think it was 3 or 4 months after I had left my position at Wizards of the Coast, we published War Machine, and then the rest is sort of privateer history.
That's awesome. And when you were mentioning FASA there, I of course always geek out a little bit because I love the FASA Star Trek system.
Oh yeah.
I played that a lot when I was a kid, and that was awesome. I don't know. I just always find it fascinating to hear how people kind of either end up starting their own business. Before we dive into Privateer Press a little bit more, I guess, what do you think of kind of in today's world with kind of the ease of self-publishing, where anybody can publish a PDF of something if they want to, compared to even maybe say back then in the early 2000s?
Yeah, it's definitely changed. 20 years later, after starting the company, the fundamentals haven't really changed that much, but the access to the information and the tools is so much greater. So, back when we were doing it, the average person probably didn't know how to get a book printed or even where to start with that. And so the only reason that we really did it was I'd already worked for, a few game companies at that point. So I'd been around publishing and I'd done it myself with the comic books years before. So I had a working knowledge of how to bring these products together and get them made. Now, if you don't know something, you go on the internet and you Google it, and somebody's made a tutorial video for you, so you can become an expert on anything in a few minutes. And then of course with the rise of crowdfunding, that took away the cost barrier, because the other side of it is, if you might know how, but if you don't have the capital to get something printed and distributed or get it out there, then you got to be able to find the money somewhere. Crowdfunding has made that easy, but then also, as you said, digital publishing is basically free. You can create a PDF and put it up and distribute it or sell it, or and there's so many different platforms and ways to do it that it's kind of it's a very, very different kind of world now. I always say now it's the best time ever to be a gamer, because whatever you want exists. And if it doesn't already exist today, it will tomorrow.
I absolutely agree. I still get a little mystified sometimes when I hear people saying that, the gaming industry or role-playing games are going away, or the industry is not doing well. I just don't even understand that, because like you said, like, if there's not a game out there that you can find that you would like to play, well, first off, I don't even believe that. But second, you could publish it. You could write it and publish it and find people to play it.
Yeah, it's for sure. I mean, if you look at the numbers that get reported from the industry side of things, or through Kickstarter, the market for gaming on the whole continues to get bigger and bigger every year. Yeah. And so there's there's an increase in the consumerism for gaming products, for sure. But the prolificness of self-publishing, or just publishing in general, not even necessarily self-publishing, but the sheer number of game publishers now is so high that there aren't very many companies that are doing as well as, say, they might have done 5 years or 10 years ago, when there was less competition in the market.
How do you feel then about hobby publishers, who just, like me, perhaps, that just publish, some game material that they think of, or, release books that they know would be helpful since they run a lot of games?
I mean, I think it's great, because it's exactly what I would be doing if I wasn't doing Privateer. I'd be working someplace else, and I'd still be making game stuff. So one way or the other, it's just, like I said, when you got the bug, it doesn't go away.
Yeah.
But yeah, the space has changed for sure, because of how easy it is to deliver to deliver material. Now, back when we started Privateer, there were quite a number of different publishing companies, but they numbered in the low dozens maybe. Mm-hmm. And now there's hundreds. And so it does make it more challenging to, keep the attention or get the attention of customers in order to keep your product lines moving.
That's good to hear. And I think, too, just that it shows that the market, there's room for a lot of different products and a lot of different niches within the market that can handle a lot of products that, say, huge companies, say like Hasbro or something, wouldn't think would be profitable, but smaller companies can kind of fill those niches.
I think there's a lot of different sort of levels that you can service, right? There's not a lot of space for very many Dungeons and Dragons, right?
Sure.
You're going to have that dominant brand there, or your Magic the Gathering, or there's a few sort of keystone product lines out there, but there's lots of others that thrive and do well, and that may not even be widely known, but they've still got an audience. And, the thing about games also is once you've got an audience, a community that is excited and enthusiastic around a game or a property or setting, then if you take care of them, then really they want to keep experiencing more of that world. So, yeah. And it's great. We've been doing this for 20 years, publishing material, role-playing games and miniatures games and board games all around our Iron Kingdoms setting. And, even after 20 years, we haven't exhausted what we can do. And we've got people that have been with us since the beginning as players, and members of our community. And that's a long time to keep somebody's attention. I mean, you think about like television, right? You can barely manage to keep an audience for 3 seasons, but with games, they can be everlasting.
If they like that game, they really have no reason to move on from that, and so they need new material. Will just keep them coming back to that same game. And then I think too people realize that game masters or dungeon masters they need material all the time. If they're running a weekly game throughout the year, they just need material all the time.
Definitely.
Now, in the intro, I said that you were the chief creative officer at Privateer Press. Can you kind of just define what chief creative officer means?
Yeah, basically, I'm involved in just about every aspect of what we do, and so I'll do game design. I'll do art direction. I work with our game designers and developers and our artists and our graphic designers. And so kind of what I was describing about the role of art direction, bringing together the visual vision, which sounds really redundant. But as the chief creative officer, I sort of have my hands on every part of the creative process to bring everything together with a cohesive vision. So whether it's the writing, the setting development, the game design, I'm sort of directing that entire process. So it's kind of analogous to a film director who works with, the art department and the sound designer and the composer, the actors, and ultimately sort of guides all of those different sort of disparate roles into one final product that, hopefully holds together on viewing. And then as well, because I own the company, I'm also involved in the business development and our production and just about it, our marketing, everything that we do. So okay. I chose the role of chief creative officer to try and make sure that I never got too far away from the the creative process, because that's why I started the company, and that's what that's what I love about making games. But as the owner, it's also very easy to get like bogged down and sidetracked into, dealing with our distribution or our production pipeline, or all these other processes that aren't necessarily creative. And so I want to always make sure that I'm still finding some time to participate in the creative side of it.
Now, do you come up with the ideas for the different settings and games?
Yes. Yeah. In most of the cases, I was the inception point for the setting. Sometimes designing the games first. A lot of times I'll prototype the games and then I'll hand them off to the development team, and then they make them much, much better before we ever get around to publishing.
I run into a lot of people that talk about that they have ideas for games, and as the owner of a company, do you suggest people like pitch game ideas to companies, or would you just suggest that they stick to maybe self-publishing?
I know that there are professionals who do contract game design, and there are companies that hire out for that kind of thing. We never have. I remember we tried a couple times to work with contractors, but we're a small team, and so we always have been very focused on just what we were doing, and which is usually more than we can comfortably do in a given amount of time. So for us, that's never been a route that we would go. But I know that it does exist, and there's some pretty famous game designers out there that have done really great stuff for multiple companies.
Now, you had mentioned your miniatures game, War Machine. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that? Yeah,
War Machine has been around since 2003. It's set in our sort of, we call it the steam powered fantasy setting, or full metal fantasy setting of the Iron Kingdoms, and we took a lot of the classic sort of fantasy tropes, and back in 2000 when the company started, and we sort of boldly tried to ratchet up the sort of the dynamics and of fantasy. So there's our setting of the Iron Kingdoms has guns and gunpowder, and most notably, magic and technology work together there. And so one of the cornerstones of the Iron Kingdom setting is that we have autonomous walking robots called steamjacks, which are basically like they're steam powered robots, but they have a magical brain so that they can act autonomously. And in warfare, they're called warjacks, and these things are weaponized robots that are like huge walking tanks, and they sort of become the tanks of the kingdoms in this setting. In War Machine, you build an army around a character called a Warcaster, and a Warcaster is a sort of a battle mage that is they're great warriors, and they're also powerful spellcasters, and they have a rare ability rather, that they can telepathically control or communicate and control the warjacks on the battlefield with them. And so they can actually channel their power into the warjacks and take over control and sort of boost their fighting abilities or other special abilities that may be built into the warjack. And the warjacks over time sort of develop personalities the longer that they are fighting beside a Warcaster, and they start to develop relationships and personalities, and they become characters sort of unto themselves. So War Machine is the game where you build an army of soldiers and warjacks, and it all sort of revolves around your Warcaster, and you fight out these great sort of epic battles in the Iron Kingdoms.
What was kind of the appeal to you as you were starting to create it, between kind of combining like steam powered with magic?
When we started working on the Witchfire books, we didn't actually have a setting, and so we started to sort of put a skin around it. We did everything backwards. Normally you would create a setting book and then a module. Instead, we started with the module, and then we started writing world info into these game books, and each one sort of opened the curtains more and more on this setting, and we were very much making it up as we went along as well. But back then there wasn't a lot of variety in the fantasy space, and it was really before the whole steampunk movement took off. So we liked the idea of steam power and a fantasy world that was in the middle of an industrial revolution. We liked those the hardware elements. The setting is very gear centric. Like there's a lot of like crazy contraptions and gear. The technology of magic and mechanical things working together is called mechanica, and so anything that's mechanica in the setting, we sort of replaced the idea of magic items and magical artifacts with things that were built and crafted by artisans and mechanics that could be infused with magic. And so they'll have the equivalent of a battery, but it's a magical power source that plugs into the hilt of a sword, or maybe a machine that can cloak you or something like that. So it was really I'd say the impetus was following our muse with the things that we liked, and also trying to find a way to create a fantasy setting in a way that hadn't been done, so that it would stand out.
Maybe just for my own clarification, War Machine, is that a miniatures game, or is it a tabletop RPG?
Yeah, War Machine is a miniatures game. Okay. It's set in the Iron Kingdom setting. The Iron Kingdoms is the setting that we established in the Witchfire RPG books. So we've done role playing games in the Iron Kingdoms. We've done board games set in the Iron Kingdoms, and then most notably the War Machine.
Now the Iron Kingdoms, I believe that has a 6D kind of system for the tabletop role playing game.
Yeah, the tabletop role playing game is it uses D6, a few of them in the combat system, and all the sort of conflict resolution. So we've I think just about everything that we've ever done has used 6-sided dice. We never really got too far out into the various polyhedral stuff. The 3D6 is a great, it's the right word. So now I'm going to look like I don't know what I'm talking about, because I don't. When you have 3 6-sided dice, the numbers that it rolls, it gives you a really nice bell curve that is for results. And so we've always enjoyed designing around that sort of number set. So we use that in War Machine. We use that in the Iron Kingdoms Full Metal Fantasy role-playing game. We've used it in quite a few places. Although the last few games that we've done, we moved to a different system. There's still 6-sided dice, but we call them strike dice, and they don't have numbers on them. They actually are. It's a success-based system, so you're rolling dice and counting up the number of successes that you have. But those aren't too far off of the whole 3D6 and 2D6 sort of system too. So it gives us some math that we can plot.
I know you have quite a number of games in that. What would kind of another game that you would think people should check out of yours?
Boy, we've got quite a few right now. Yeah. I'll start with the other games in the Iron Kingdom setting. Mm-hmm. Last year we brought out a new miniatures game called Riot Quest. And Riot Quest is a really fun sort of hybrid between board games and miniatures games. They're hobby miniatures, so you get to paint them and customize them. But you play it out on a hex map, and the idea is you put together a crew of really wacky characters. It's a little bit of a parody on the Iron Kingdoms in some ways, because we've taken these characters that are very serious and stoic and known in War Machine and in the role-playing game, and we've sort of done a Saturday morning cartoon version of them. And for those young kids who grew up on Netflix and don't know what Saturday morning cartoons are, they're just like the cartoons that you see anywhere else. But back in our day, you had to get up really early on Saturday morning to see them. So, and so in Riot Quest is fun. You play with 5 to 10 miniatures. That's your crew, and it's a very chaotic, rambunctious sort of game where you're racing around this dungeon map to gather treasure and collect bounties and things. And so that's a super fun game. We've also got another game. It's on its second edition right now, called Monster Apocalypse, and this is the miniatures game of giant fighting monsters, kaiju. So we've got giant robots and every kind of giant monster that you ever saw on the big screen or wanted to see, and then you set up a map with skyscrapers and other industrial buildings, and so you create the city, and then you duke it out with your opponent over the city, and you're smashing the monsters into buildings. And by the end of the game, the whole city's like leveled, and one monster is left standing. So that's a real fun one too. And then most recently, we took a leap from the Iron Kingdom setting and went 5,000 years into the future. We have a new game coming out called Warcaster. So Warcaster is actually on Kickstarter right now. It just launched yesterday. So by the time people are hearing this, it's probably not on. It won't be running anymore. Yeah. But the game will be coming out shortly after. It'll be in stores probably around July, and it went great. We funded in 27 minutes yesterday, and so now we're just racking up stretch goals as we move along. But Warcaster it has this. We planted the seeds for Warcaster in the Iron Kingdoms, and then jumped 5,000 years into the future in a different galaxy, and we have a whole new sort of story that we're telling. And it's a sci-fi game, but we've done some different things with it as well. There's no actual space travel in this, but the setting takes place over 1,000 worlds in this galaxy called Cirrus. And these worlds are all connected by a network of what are called void gates. And so the way they travel from planet to planet is to fly big airships through these void gates. And then we've reskinned the idea of magic as a natural energy source called arcanescence. We call it ARC for short. And this is a very valuable resource that everybody in the galaxy is fighting to control. But it's also what the Warcasters use to create their magical effects, which we call ciphers. Ciphers are like spells, and there's different classes of them that can be cast on different things. And they channel the ARC into the mechanical equipment of their troops, of their warjacks and their vehicles. And the game is a very sort of interesting experience where you're managing a resource, but you're not spending it. You're sort of allocating it in different places at a time, and you never have as much as you want. And that's sort of where the strategy of things come in. So this is our next miniatures game that is coming along, and Privateer is best known as a miniatures company. We've done the role playing games and card games, and we've done every kind of game that you can imagine. But miniatures have been sort of our bread and butter for the last 17 or 18 years.
Yeah. Well, congratulations for funding in 27 minutes. That's unbelievable.
Thank you. Yeah, we were pretty excited to see it move that quickly.
That whole setting sounds fantastic. I will definitely provide links to Warcaster in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com so everybody can check that out.
Yeah, that would be great. Warcaster.com is the website set up for it. It's got a pretty good deep dive into the setting and the various factions that are in it. And we hope that our plans are to do a lot with the setting because it's just sort of starting right now, but eventually we'd love to get into a role-playing game in the setting and explore it in every way we can.
Yeah, it seems like with 1,000 worlds, you have a lot of material there to work with.
We got a lot of raw material to work with.
Yeah, a lot of opportunities. So yeah, I will put a link to warcaster.com in the show notes for this episode. I guess, is there anywhere else that somebody should go if they want to check out some of your other games as well?
Just privateerpress.com, and that's sort of our portal to everything. And from there, you can see everything that we've got going on.
Okay, great. And I will put a link to that as well in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com so everybody can check out all of your games and the different settings. Well, I guess, Matt, it has been a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Guys, there you have it. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation that I had with Matt today. As I mentioned in the episode, I have provided links to Privateer Press in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. Please head over there so you can learn more about some of these awesome games and projects that Matt and his team are working on at Privateer Press. Now, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps and a little bit more. Plus, you'll never miss an episode of this show. If you want to support the show financially, you can on Patreon. You could go to patreon.com/dicegeeks and learn how to support the show financially there. That would mean the world to me. It would just be a great vote of confidence so that I would know that I should keep producing these episodes each and every week. Now, again, I just thank you so much for listening. And until next time, keep gaming.